I'm Mike Brown, author, nerd, and host of the Dark Poutine podcast. Join me and Morgan Knudsen, author, paranormal researcher, and host of the TV shows Paranormal 911 and Haunted Hospitals, as we take you on a journey for the curious about the unseen, the mysterious, and the incredible things happening in the world about us. Welcome to Supernatural Circumstances. In this episode of Supernatural Circumstances, we take a look at the possible involvement of a Yeti in one of the most enduring mysteries of modern times, the incident at Dyatalov Pass. I covered this story in Chapter 13 of the Perpetual Puzzles section of my best-selling book, Murder, Madness, and Mayhem, available at fine booksellers now. The story began in 1959 in the Northern Ural Mountains on Kholat Syakhl, which translated from the local Mansi dialect means dead mountain. A group of 9 experienced hikers, 2 women and 8 men, on a skiing expedition from the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Yekaterinburg, Russia, died on the mountain that February under mysterious circumstances. The site was later named Dyatalov Pass in memory of the group's leader, 23-year-old Igor Alekseyevich Dyatlov. Later in the show, we'll chat with Lyle Blackburn, cryptozoologist, podcaster, and musician. But first, here's Morgan with this episode's story.
How many of us have told stories around the campfire? We've sat around on cold nights, gathered by the heat of the flame in the dark of the forest, with flashlights and s'mores, and spoke names like Candyman, the Boogeyman, and the demons of the dark. Many adults and kids have strong memories of laying in their tent, hearing raccoons and deer snooping through their leftover food, while their tent mates wondered if it might be indeed one of the monsters they had envisioned around the campfire. For First Nations people around the world, the creatures of the woods, wild, and the mountains have a significance that Western settlers and descendants rarely understand or respect. The roar of the wings of the eagles and the thunderbirds, the power of the bear, and the intricate roles nature plays with all living things and the Creator, all have legends and stories that often become brushed aside by our modern, science-driven world. Here, the world of spirit gets trampled in our speaking and in our actions, as urban sprawl begins to spread into what was once contested territory by both humans and cryptids alike. However, across the globe, in the frozen wild of Russia, the stories of monsters and myths are not so easily set aside. In Tibet, the Sherpa people speak openly about their life with a creature that they believe is the protector and the god of the mountains. One who preys on their zapko, their beast of burden, a cross between a yak and a cow, and occasionally on the people themselves. They respect it, but their fear of it runs deep. In the West, we know it as the Yeti, but it was not until an expedition to Mount Everest by famed climber Eric Shipton that the giant, hairy, bipedal ape was brought to attention. These giant ape-like monsters with brown or golden hair, conical heads, and of huge stature were said to have left behind tracks which Shipton's team promptly photographed and grew famous for. And it's said by the locals that they are positioned to enact justice towards whoever disrespects the mountains. Whether this is true or not, or whether they were just an animal which protects its own space, is up for debate. However, in the Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union in 1959, the concept of the Yeti was brought to a new and terrifying public awareness when a group of hiking students from the Ural Polytechnic Institute was found slaughtered and mutilated in what is now known as the Dyatlov Pass incident. Since then, Yeti sightings there have increased, as well as the disappearance of up to 9 more hikers as late as 2019. The pass was named after expedition leader Igor Alekseyevich, a 23-year-old radio engineering student who was leading a ski trip. 8 men and 2 women went with him, all grade 2 hikers with ski tour experience, and receiving grade 3 level upon their return, the highest you can acquire and would require traversing at least 300 kilometers. On January 23, 1959, the Dyatlov group had their route approved by officials and they were off the very same day. Now, I live in the prairies of Alberta, within a short distance of our Western Rockies. The temperatures here can easily drop as low as Siberia. Possibly the most deafening aspects of these winters is the silence. The snow absorbs all sound like nature's studio, and very little is left of any living thing outside. When the Dyatlov group fell silent in the frozen landscape on February 12th, by February 20th, the families demanded a searcher party be dispatched to the Ural Mountain region to find them. On February 26th, the first sign of the party was found. Mikhail Sherevin, the student who found the tent, said that the tent was torn in half, covered with snow. It was empty, and all the group's belongings and shoes had been left behind. The investigators on site noticed that the tent was torn from the inside. The group had not only left the safety and heat of the camp, but they had left in one hell of a hurry, leaving behind jackets, shoes, socks, and all their aid. They followed some of the tracks down to the edge of the woods, on the opposite side of the pass. At the forest edge, under a large Siberian pine, the searchers found the visible remains of a small fire. There were the first two bodies, shoeless, dressed in underwear. The branches on the tree were broken up to 5 meters high, suggesting that one of the skiers had climbed up in attempts to get a better view, or perhaps to escape the same thing that had driven them from the tent. The true horrors, however, were still to come. Between the pine and the camp, they found 3 more corpses. Upon examination, it looked as if they were trying to make their way back to the camp in the dark, but the 4 travelers, including Dyatlov himself, remained missing until their horrific discovery on May the 4th. Upon inquiry, the nightmare began to unfold for investigators. It was determined that the first hikers were found dead of hypothermia and were found in the bloody clothes of the other students, suggesting that they had taken clothing from the other bodies rather than risk going back to the tent for their things. 3 of the hikers had fatal injuries. 1 had his skull cracked open. 2 more had their chests crushed in. According to one investigator, the force required to cause such damage would have been extreme, impact injuries like one would incur in a car crash. All 4 bodies had been found at the bottom of the creek in a running stream of water and had soft tissue damage to their head and face. One student was missing her tongue, eyes, and parts of her lips, as well as facial tissue and a fragment of skull bone, while another had his eyes torn out. One more had his eyebrows ripped from his face. The entire attack, according to primatologists and cryptozoologists, had all the terrifying hallmarks of an attack by a great ape. Chimpanzees, for example, tend to target the face of their victims, tearing at eyes, tongue, noses, and lips, as well as smashing their fists into chests and skulls. The local people in the area knew the answer to the mystery that no one wanted to hear, but they were ignored. Immediately, suspicions turned to the local tribe, the Mansi people. To dispel the theory of an attack by an indigenous group, the lead investigator stated that the severe injuries the students endured could not have been caused by human beings, because the force of the blows had been too strong. The horror, however, lingered. With no suspects, no one to blame, the investigators turned to one piece of physical evidence that they could collect, a camera that had been found lying in the snow next to one of the bodies. Upon examination of the film, one photo stood out from the rest. One of the last photos on the roll was of an upright, bipedal creature with dark fur leaning out from behind a tree and seemingly watching the hikers. Immediately, the files were hidden away in Russia's archives, never to be seen again until, in 2009, when they were released to the public eye. In the meantime, the Dyatlov Pass became notorious for more disappearances. Hikers that would set out through the pass would disappear, never to be heard from again, all while sightings of the Yeti grew more and more common. In 2019, the Indian Army, who was doing an exercise in the area, photographed a plethora of large great ape tracks in the same area. This made the local papers immediately. Finally, during the same year, Russia felt compelled to reopen the investigation, but with a clause. The investigators were only allowed to investigate 3 possible explanations. These consisted of a slab avalanche, an avalanche, or a hurricane. All were eliminated. In July of 2020, the Russians finally gave in to the notion that an avalanche must have indeed been the cause of death, and it was ruled official. However, there are grave issues with this theory, and it does not explain the strange photograph of the oddly formed stranger lurking in the trees. The location of the incident did not have any obvious signs of an avalanche having taken place. The bodies had a very fine layer of snow covering them, and the bodies didn't appear in any way to have been swept away from the camp. Other issues included the fact that the area had no history of avalanche before or since the incident, and an analysis of the terrain suggests that even if there could have been a very specific avalanche that found its way into the area, its path would have gone past the tent. In 2019, a Swedish-Russian expedition was made to the site, and after investigations, they proposed that a violent katabatic wind was a plausible explanation for the incident. A rare and sudden hurricane-like wind that comes with a severe drop in temperature. However, this does little to explain the severe injuries, the photograph, or the other missing hikers who have disappeared since. The local people are clear on their thoughts. They believe firmly it was, to them, the most obvious explanation. Since then, it is said to be commonly known among them as Yeti territory. That pass is out of bounds for anyone who values their lives. Visitors are encouraged to avoid it if they want to see another hike in their life, and this proves to be true to this day, as hikers continue to vanish in areas across the world where Yetis are frequently sighted. We like to think, as investigators, that we can study such creatures of the wild from a steady distance. They live in remote areas of the imagination, worlds away in the hilltops of places we read about in textbooks. But Yeti sightings include Canada and the United States, specifically Mount Shasta in California, where investigator Brian David Wallenstein, out for a walk with his family after a Thanksgiving dinner, encountered a family of 3 Yetis at a rundown ski lodge on the mountainside. Rare as it is, the most elusive of cryptids has been sighted in locations where one thinks they would be more apt to run into a Sasquatch before ever running across a Yeti. Russian hominologist Dr. Igor Burtsev believes that these growing reports of encounters have directly to do with one thing: climate change. Just as other animals are being forced to change territories and to adapt to new hunting habits and changing habitat, the Yeti is no different. Urban sprawl, even in the mountains of Tibet, has begun to encroach on what was once forest and wilderness. Burtsev goes on to speak on the notion that the Yeti's change in behavior really is a warning. Local people who live amongst these remote creatures believe they are protectors of the forest, spirit guardians of nature, and their frequent appearances are a message to those who are not respecting the environment. Regardless of the conclusions you reach about the Dyatlov Pass or thousands of reports, photographs, and documented physical evidence of the infamous abominable snowman, we still tell our stories around the campfire about the monsters in the woods. We speak of dark tales on cold winter nights and typically go to bed, safe and warm, to get up the next day, believing they are just stories. However, as we get closer to nature every day, as we push the boundaries of human outreach and habitat, we may want to rethink the idea that the Yeti is simply a legend. Soon, we may no longer have the luxury to tell ourselves it will all be fine in the morning.
Next up, Morgan and I chat with our guest, Lyle Blackburn. Here's the audio of that conversation.
Today, I'm so happy that we get such an amazing guest, because we're so lucky on Supernatural Circumstances to have some of, I think, the brightest minds in cryptozoology and parapsychology and all the sciences, and it's so cool. And Lyle Blackburn is just another one of those really great minds and adventurous spirits that we get to talk to, and it's wonderful. So a little bit about Lyle for our audience. Lyle Blackburn is a native Texan known for his work in writing, music, and film. He is the author of several acclaimed books, including The Beast of Boggy Creek and Sinister Swamps, whose subject matter reflects his lifelong fascination with legendary creatures and strange phenomenon. Lyle is also the founder of the rock band Ghoultown and a narrator and producer of documentary films such as The Mothman of Point Pleasant and Boggy Creek Monster. And guys, if you have not seen them, see them. The documentaries are amazing. I love The Bray Road Beast as well. Lyle is a frequent guest on radio programs such as Coast to Coast AM and has been featured on various television shows airing on Animal Planet, Destination America, Travel Channel, Discovery Science, and Shudder. In his work with Monsters and Mysteries in America, he served as both consulting producer and special episode host. Lyle, if I missed anything, feel free to fill it in.
That takes up the whole show. The bio.
I know. I have the same problem, but I mean, it's all worth mentioning because you've done so much. And today we were talking about the Yeti and Sasquatch and missing people. And I'm so glad you're here to sort of throw some input on this because I think it's been theorized for a long time, at least over the last number of years, that, you know, some of these great apes like Yetis and whatnot might actually be responsible for attacks, for missing people and things like that. And the Yeti has been known to be a little bit more on the edgy side than Sasquatch. Is this common?
Well, there's actually many more reports of Bigfoot or Sasquatch aggression than there are Yeti. Over the years, the Yeti is what sightings there are typically, are from a distance, a figure in the distance or something, observed moving across the mountain passes. And a lot of the Yeti, the belief in the Yeti comes from secondhand stories or footprints. Westerners found mostly footprints, which led to a lot of newspaper coverage. But the Yeti, in my opinion, there's a few major stories that kind of suggest that they could be aggressive. But for the most part, like most of these, they're just shy, reclusive, elusive sort of beasts.
Yeah, that makes sense. And with all the encounters that I've read about over the years, because I find the hominids and the Sasquatch cases, if I could have done something else with my career other than parapsychology, it would have been cryptozoology, because I find these animals so interesting. And there seem to be such distinct behavioral and physical differences between these hominids. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, depending on the region and what's being described, whether that's, regional cases of around the U.S. of certain Bigfoot-like creatures, or just on a world scale where a creature, a similar hominid, upright bipedal ape-like creature is reported in Australia or China, or of course in the Himalayas where the Yeti is, they can differ. And, that enters into the sort of motif and the general understanding of them. As somebody who, focused a lot of research on the legendary case of the Boggy Creek Monster, which was made famous by the 1970s film The Legend of Boggy Creek, and it was kind of a horror film / documentary, and that really played up the aggressive nature of this creature, and which was literally what people reported, attacks and things like that. And so that kind of got me interested in, what other attacks, are there by these creatures? And of course there's incidents like Ape Canyon from the 1920s where Bigfoots were assailing some miners and, in the Pacific Northwest. And then, the descriptions of these creatures, depending on where they're located, like I said, I mean, it's a kind of a complicated thing, but, skunk apes are described a little bit differently as maybe a Bigfoot of the Pacific Northwest. Skunk apes live in a swampy environment and are more allegedly ape-like. And then, you go to descriptions of the Yeti where it's, more like almost a bear-like creature or a feral human, but without specimens to analyze, it's just hard to say what the true, biological differences really are between these things.
I always sort of thought of them as like different breeds of dog, if that maybe that's too simple a thing for them. They just seem like they have so many similarities, but the differences are like from a poodle to a Rottweiler kind of thing.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, though it's hard, dogs have been given the red carpet in order to breed, and we've facilitated so much of that it's kind of a stretch to say we even have one species of, bipedal ape-like creatures existing. So I think that it's probably not a case where there's a lot of different, but there's certainly, like you say, they're just like other animals, there's brown bear and polar bear and grizzly bear. There could easily be, a dozen different species that are closely related yet different, and may have adapted that way due to their environment, because these are, allegedly living in all sorts of environments around the world.
Yeah, and it's so neat when they, you've heard of people like Dr. Jeff Meldrum and John Bindernagel and people like that, when they compare these prints, and the prints are distinctly different. Prints that have been found of the Sasquatch look notably different than, say, for example, the prints with the divergent toe of the Yeti. And it's interesting, but it makes sense that these different creatures have adapted to these different terrains. And it just, to me, it makes sense. And speaking of bears and things like that, there were thoughts for a little while from Oxford and Lausanne universities that the Yeti might be, in fact, some sort of prehistoric bear or something like that, due to the DNA that was analyzed by Professor Brian Sykes. And there was a discovery of hair in Bhutan, so for the audience, that was compared to the jawbone of an ancient bear that was found out to be the same. And yet, the Sherpa people that are there have said, there's no way, like, this is not a bear. This is an upright bipedal creature. What's your thought on that?
Well, yeah, certainly. I mean, with, the modern science that we have to analyze things, when they compared that, it did come up with a match to an ancient polar bear, which, then the theories were, wow, maybe we have this surviving species of polar bear. And even though that's not an ape, it still is, it's a cryptid, something that is surviving that we didn't expect to survive, such as a coelacanth or something. But that, like most of these things, isn't definitive. And I think there was some debate on where these samples came from.
Yeah.
Some of them came from, some specimen that was alleged to be a Yeti and already kind of fabricated or known already to be a bear. So, of course that's going to come back saying it's a bear. So, none of these ever really answer the question, other than to say that, well, that's a possibility. We may have an explanation here that is more mundane. It's a bear, but still something that we didn't expect. But again, until there's an actual body there, these are just grasping at straws or grasping at hairs just to try to, answer a huge question. So,
it is a big question. It is a big question, and I think it's such an important question in the the history of people and humanity. And we've learned so much over the last 5 years about the divergence of the human, where we are now, humans and Homo sapiens and all of Neanderthals. I think there's more discoveries now coming out about the evolution of who we are than ever before.
Right. And that just goes to show you, we never really know everything. And that's the whole premise here, is that people, oh, well, we've discovered everything. We know everything, and we know everything from the fossil record, which obviously isn't true. We're constantly revising science and revising that bushy tree of our own ancestry, as well as similar or our brethren in the great apes. So, you never know. And that's why we should never be content to just sit there. And even in the case of a Yeti, where, it goes kind of interweaves between folklore and sightings of an animal. Well, we don't really have an answer. So we should always be open to these kind of tests of, continually trying to solve the puzzle.
Absolutely. And yeah, and every piece of this helps. And even from the parapsychology standpoint, because that's where I come from, that what you just said about possibilities, I think, is just hitting the nail on the head. That people tend to shut down that possibilities are so, they're so vast, there are so many, and we really need to remember that this science is a tool moving forward. We're getting glimpses and pieces of the puzzle, but it's a tool. And when we were mentioning the sort of the folklore of the Yeti and the Aboriginal, the Sherpa people and whatnot of the area, and I mean, they are 100% convinced that this is something else, that this is like the god, basically like the god of the mountains, the protector of the mountains. And if you had a case like we in the podcast here, we talked about the Dyatlov Pass and how there was theories going around thinking that maybe this might have been caused by running into a Yeti or something, some other creature like that. Do you think that some of these hominids might actually be responsible for some of the missing persons cases that have been reported over the years?
Yeah, I think it's definitely possible. I mean, if we have to presume that the creatures exist first, and then second, if they do, then certainly, like any animals, there could be rogue individuals that have a temperament that's, more aggressive, or they could have felt threatened in some way. I mean, most of the time bears are, just look at you and move on. I've literally been in the mountains and seen wild bear walking around. And while most times that's the case, occasionally, if they felt threatened or in certain circumstances, they could attack. And so, some of these stranger disappearances where seemingly no explanations and other things, that obviously crosses over into, well, could it have been a Bigfoot or what have you at the cause? And now we sort of have two mysteries intersecting, but still that could very well be. And a creature like this is big. It could be very dangerous, very powerful, and, simply carry somebody off very easily if they wanted to.
Yeah, I think I agree. And I mean, it's amazing when you look at other other apes or hominids or anything like that, and the level of power that these things have, and their adaptability to be in these environments is one of the things that I so admire about them. If a case like this came across your desk, where somebody was either deemed missing, or a body was found or something like that, from the perspective of our current technology and nowadays, as a cryptozoologist, how would you go about determining if this was a factor in a case like this?
Well, I think the first thing to do, as in whether you're looking at a case of an attack or just a sighting, is to try to eliminate everything else.
Absolutely.
The more common, down to earth explanations. So you would just start like you would any other case where, is this a place where, somebody would pull a hoax, or is it possible that, what is the credibility of the witness? And if we had a body that was, been attacked by an animal, obviously that can be, that person's injuries could be examined by, doctors and things, which would, help eliminate common possibilities. So you start there, and then, if there's, you kind of rule out everything else and it kind of falls into the mystery zone, then you could say, well, okay, what cryptid reports do we have around here? Is this a place where there's been a lot of Bigfoot attacks? I mean, a lot of Bigfoot sightings. and therefore the possibility of an attack there could take place. So, I would just go about it like that. And then, again, you're just kind of going to run into, where you're speculating, but
Yeah.
you kind of chalk that up in that, I've got a case file of attacks where it's like, well, here's a bunch of stuff that, could be Bigfoot could be responsible for, or Dogman, or what have you.
Yeah, and yeah, I agree. And very similar to anything that we do from the parapsychological standpoint too is, I think that ruling out of these other explanations sometimes I think can get overlooked, but at the same time, I think that can get in the way sometimes as well, where people are leaning into an explanation that might be a natural explanation, but really doesn't fit what's happened. So it's a catch-22. Do you find that with this work as well, where the explanation can be likely that it's something like a Bigfoot and the experts are leaning in a direction that just doesn't add up?
Oh, certainly. I mean, there's sometimes where it's being explained away, that even that is more absurd than just saying it could have been a Bigfoot, and it just all depends on who's trying to explain it away and their own perspectives and where they're starting from with beliefs. I mean, I just start totally neutral. I neither, I'm just trying to go where things point, whether that's something really weird or just something normal. And some people come at it, a skeptic's going to come at it. It's not a Bigfoot. It's got to be this. And, they've provided an explanation that's,
Yep.
like you said, just try to make it fit, stuff like that. So yeah, that's common, just depending on who's providing the explanation.
That's the one thing that's always caught me about the Dyatlov Pass case was the fact that the Russian government gave the investigators two answers that they were allowed to come to. It was either an avalanche or a slab avalanche, and that was it. They weren't allowed to consider anything else. It was just, you have to pick a conclusion, pick the one you like best, and that's the one that we're going to run with. And it's infuriating for investigations, I think, that still don't have those answers. And you hear sometimes about this evidence disappearing from universities and things being lost. And in the case of, for example, the Minnesota Iceman, the body just got replaced completely. Why do you think there's such contention around these creatures specifically?
Well, right. I mean, yeah, like in the case of the Dyatlov Pass, it's like they don't want to hear anything else, and you don't do investigations like that. You just start neutral and say, well, pursue
Absolutely.
what the evidence shows. You can't just say, well, here's your choice. It's not a multiple choice conclusion here.
Yeah.
But most established organizations, most scientists, everything else just doesn't want to hear any nonsense about Yetis or Bigfoot or whatever. They've already ruled that out, and they're not going to listen, for various reasons. Obviously this stuff has become such a pop culture type thing, that they just don't consider it science, or they're just ignorant of what there is for evidence and such. So, yeah, it's just a problem, and things disappearing or not being treated with respect in terms of, okay, here we have some hairs that might be from some unknown creature. Maybe they're not considered as valuable as some other case that is a crime or something else, and those things get lost and misplaced and, just like all this stuff. But I think that's probably because once it gets into the hands of people who don't take it seriously, it's not handled like it would be something that they do take seriously. So, stuff gets mysteriously lost, and it's just the nature of this, and also the nature of humans. They also lose important blood spatter evidence and other things from major cases. much less, like, oh, what was it, a Bigfoot hair? I don't know what I did with it.
I mean, we see a lot of, you mentioned crime cases, and we see a lot of tunnel vision in that way. An investigator will determine that this one individual may be the person involved, and then we end up convicting the wrong person. And I see a lot of parallels in the way people think about these creatures and the possibility of them. They see one road, and that's the one that they're going to travel down, and there's no other nothing that will drag them from that particular path.
Right, and that's unfortunately human nature. Just a person's perceptions and biases and inner, like a hunch, it can be wrong. Those things aren't precise. And yeah, if you have tunnel vision, then you're going to be chasing the wrong path. And we've seen that on many crime shows where 20 years later, oops, well, we're back to where, the first guy we interviewed was actually the guy, and we got sidetracked, or they ignored something and should have followed up. And that's exactly the same with any of this other stuff. Biases just govern where people put their efforts.
So how do you address that bias in somebody if you come up against it in somebody who's not willing to have the conversation? How do you address it in a way that makes it maybe more palatable for them?
Well, I think just in general, if I'm investigating or doing research on these topics, I always try to identify with people who are skeptical. I mean, it's natural, and I try to just say, yeah, it's, I understand where you're coming from, but hey, listen to this, and let me tell you a few things. And usually when you kind of identify with a person, instead of just coming at them with, you need to believe in this or whatever, you say, yeah, I understand why you're skeptical. They'll usually kind of listen to you and then come around to, well, as a matter of fact, something weird did happen or whatever. And just kind of understanding everybody's different and their views are based on just what they know. So I do that with any investigation, and usually can get along with people, whether they're total skeptics or whatever. They'll have the conversation, which is what you want when you're doing investigations. You want everybody's input, so you don't want to sort of, alienate them right from the gate. So it works well, especially if you're trying to get some information from, say, a park ranger or somebody else, that doesn't usually want to talk about it. I just say, hey, we totally understand, you're just protecting your job and your things, this is off the record. And if you're cool, usually people will talk to you.
Mm.
Yeah, it's true. And, I think this subject matter has a factor in it that even criminal cases and things like that don't have, which is sort of the uncanny valley factor. And I wonder with Bigfoot and the Yeti and things like that, if that might be playing on people as well, that these are just a little bit too close to people, that it sort of puts that wall up, even maybe a little bit of a stronger wall than, say, the average investigation. Have you found that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you sort of give any indication you think Bigfoot is real, for example, yeah, that's a whole world of, it's human like. It's, you have to question like everything, like, well, if this thing exists, what are, how does this affect my views on the world? And
yeah,
obviously, and just straight up, people, Bigfoot is associated with crazy people and weird stuff and everything else, and people don't want to be associated with that. They probably don't. And that's kind of the general consensus, is the news always snickers now, especially, and makes Bigfoot. They don't understand much about it beyond what they see on the news, and they don't want to be laughed at. Well, I don't want to say what I saw, because then people are going to think I'm crazy. So you got to make them understand that, look, these reports are not made by all crazy people. Those are the exception. The most reports can be made by everyday people, from policemen to doctors to hunters. And you got to, make sure they understand that they're not going to be lumped into crazy, because of course people are, mindful of that. So, I think right off the bat, people just think, it's a crazy subject when they don't know much about it. That's kind of their perception.
Yeah, I think people will even avoid reporting something because they think that they'll be perceived as a crazy person.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, we always say that for every one report, there's probably 10 others that people just didn't say anything. But, I've seen over the last, I've been doing this for, a long time, and I've seen a shift in people being willing to talk. 12 years ago or something, people were like, still kind of hesitant, but because of so many TV shows and finding Bigfoot and things, people have seen examples of, well, that guy sounds just like me. They've seen normal people reporting these things. So I think people are more willing now to say, yeah, I saw something like that, than say a decade ago, or especially like 30 years ago. People were very reluctant to talk.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think these skeptics, they can be so bent on the idea that these people are just seeing something and jumping to the conclusion that that's what it is. But I know even from in investigating things like survival after death and people having experiences and whatnot, is that that's not the first thing they go to. Witnesses see something, they perceive something, and they do tend to go through the list of what could this be. They're not jumping to those conclusions. And I think skeptics need to sort of dial back the idea that all of these people are just, oh, I saw a Bigfoot, or I saw this, or I saw that. And it's like, hold on a minute. Like, these people, when you talk to them, and I'm sure you found this too, is that they went through in their head what this could be. Is this a bear? Am I looking at an unidentified animal? And they all seem to come to the conclusion, this is something I've not seen before.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, I think most cases people have already thought of all these sort of things just to try to rationalize it in their own mind. And then if they, then come to the conclusion that, I just can't explain this, then they start looking on the internet, or, finding someone to tell, or post it on post it in Facebook or whatever. So yeah, they've reviewed these things before talking.
What would you tell people, just to bring this to a conclusion? What would you tell people that have either had a frightening encounter, or are holding back from talking about it, or are sort of stuck in that fear state about whatever it is that has gone on and whatnot? What should they do if they're in that situation?
Well, I think if it's something that's bothering them, if it's something like that, and they probably can't talk about it to just anyone, then definitely, want to reach out to someone that, is going to listen and put it into perspective. And I don't know how there's no one way to find somebody. If you've read a book on the subject, maybe you like the approach of that writer, you can look them up on the internet, or you've seen somebody on a TV show that you thought sounded rational and well balanced about the subject. You could look them up, because now you can really find people so much easier on Facebook and such, that people should, if they want to share, if that's what they feel like doing, and if they feel they've had, if they got something to contribute, or something, like I said, that's bothering them, to definitely just find someone that you could tell that's involved in these subjects, like you guys, or maybe a podcast. They've listened to a lot of these stories, and podcasts are another thing that have really helped now, because you hear these podcasts and you hear people just telling of these stories. So it's like, you go, well, I'm not the only one that saw something weird. So just find someone that you can kind of just share that story, and you can even share it and say, hey, don't post publicly or post my name, but hey, what do you think? Am I crazy, or is this something that you've seen elsewhere? And that'll give people, some amount of, I guess, counseling on the subject, so to speak.
Yeah. I think it's an area that a lot of people struggle with, but you're totally right, where nowadays we are sitting in this wonderful age of information, even on these bizarre subjects like the Yeti or the Dyatlov Pass, or Sasquatch encounters, whether they're in the mountains and the whatever, in the different regions around the world. And we've got this amazing access now, and I think it is just a resource that people can really use and reach out to. Is there any resources specifically for information, like solid information on some of this stuff, that you would recommend?
I mean, I always say books are your best source. If you've encountered a flying humanoid, for example, there's books been written on that subject, or Mothman. If you've saw a Bigfoot, there's plenty of books that will give you a historical history of Bigfoot, or even some in your region. There's all these, if you saw it in Kentucky, you might get a book on Bigfoot in Kentucky. And those are a place where you can read, and then you'll get a better perspective on the history, and again, just seeing that other people, have seen things like this, and through that kind of research. I mean, television, some of the stuff is credible, some of it's not. That'll
definitely
find that
Yeah.
not as scholarly of a source. So I would just say your best source of information is always seek out some books.
Not as scholarly as a source is possibly the best definition of a lot of the television shows that I have ever heard.
Yes, and I often get that, hey, I saw this on a TV show, and I'm like, okay, let me explain what's the real truth behind that, or whatever. So, books can have errors too, but I think that's still a good source, and not even stuff posted on the internet, because I see that posted and copied and distorted, and it's like, dude, go back to the source, and somebody who spent some quality time researching the subject and can give the best encapsulation of whatever monster or cryptid or phenomenon that you're wanting to find out about.
How did you get started in this?
It's just something that I liked at an early age, and I can kind of credit the Yeti for that, because I got a book when I was in elementary school that had stories of the Yeti and Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster, sort of the early stuff. And I thought, man, this is really cool. And I'd grown up hunting with my father, so we did a lot of bow hunting and stuff. So I spent a lot of times in woods and looked at small towns and places like that, and just that kind of pairing of what lurks in the woods, just beyond, the road, always captured my imagination. And then I saw the Legend of Boggy Creek movie when I was young, and that incident in Arkansas is close to where I lived in Texas, about 3 hours away. So then it kind of made it, wow, okay, that's close to home. And, I just sort of read books on the subject and so forth. And then eventually, when I wrote my first book, it was on the Boggy Creek case, because that had always kind of interested me, and I wanted to research it as an adult. And then once I wrote that book, it was immediately television shows started calling, and the book sold well. And then I thought, okay, this is great. I'm going to continue this. So I just kind of continued researching and writing books.
Well, you're by far, I think, one of the most knowledgeable people on the subject. And it's funny that you're mentioning Boggy Creek, because that was my first introduction visually to this as well when I was a kid. I was in the same boat, and I remember seeing it, and I thought it was just horror movie. And then somewhere I heard that no, this was based on a true story, and my mind was just blown. And I thought, this is amazing. This is amazing. So that was my first introduction too. So I completely identify with that. But Lyle, thank you so much for chatting with us today. I know your time's limited, so I don't want to keep you. But if tell us website, tell audiences where they can find you.
Well, you can find out more about me and my various works at lyleblackburn.com, Lyle Blackburn.com. And, of course, my books are available on Amazon and other places. And let's see, of course, we mentioned earlier the work on the documentary films. Those are done by Small Town Monsters, who has done many, many great documentaries now since I first teamed up with them on the Boggy Creek Monster. And you can view those on Amazon Prime and even some on YouTube now and other places. So you can go to Amazon Prime and search Lyle Blackburn and watch those. So, but yeah, lyleblackburn.com.
Yeah, and for the audience, those books as well as the documentaries they're just so good. They're so in depth, and they come at it from this beautiful, factual yet storytelling perspective, and which I thoroughly love. So I mean, I know I'm definitely glued to whatever you guys have coming out, because it is the stuff's so informative. And speaking of resources that are really good, that is one of them. So Lyle, thank you so much for this.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Lyle.
Well, hey, that was great.
All right.
I think that went well.
I think so too.
Yeah, it's easy to just talk about these so many cool aspects. So yeah.
Oh, it is. They're so fascinating. I'm in Alberta, and we've got so many Bigfoot sightings here, and they're all over our woods and close to Calgary and stuff like that. And they were starting to be seen when the pandemic hit, when the lockdowns were going on. They were being seen closer and closer to the city of Calgary, and it was just, yeah, it's so interesting to live so close to these amazing things.
Yeah. It seems like, you can go just about any place and find some history of at least some kind of cryptid.
Oh yeah, I mean they're definitely kicking around Alberta. That's for anyone that's a hunter always comes back with stories, especially from northern Alberta, Nordeg and places like that. They're always coming back and saying, "Oh no, they're there. They're definitely there."
Absolutely. Canada just seems like Bigfoot country to me, Sasquatch country.
Oh, it definitely is.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's just amazing. Well, we'll get everything out there, and thank you for all your websites and pictures, and we'll promote the heck out of you. So
awesome. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks, Lyle.
All right. Y'all take it easy.
You too. Have a good one.
Okay, bye.
Here's Morgan for this episode's segment of Spiritual Healthcare.
In this episode's edition of Spiritual Healthcare, the segment of the show where you get to be the creator and designer of your paranormal and spiritual experience, we're going to tell you about a process called intention segments. Sometimes things can feel really overwhelming, and we struggle to know where to focus first. In paranormal investigation, when you have a big property to manage or any case with multiple moving parts, the best thing that we can do is begin to treat each space as a segment. And you can do the exact same thing in your life. The purpose of this exercise is to allow yourself to become more mindful and present, reducing stress, and allowing time to shape your point of attraction into something better and more intentional than just running on default settings. Your day is made up of segments in time. Washing up in the morning is a segment. Driving to work is a segment. Eating lunch is a segment. Our days are a string of segments bound together by time. What we would encourage you to try on days when you're feeling overwhelmed is to set an intention before each segment. Instead of trying to manage the entire day at once, stop and set a small intention, such as, I'm looking forward to a peaceful drive to work, before you get in your car. Then, take a breath and approach the segment expecting your set intention. You don't need to be present with the other 20 things you need to do that day. You now only have to expect a peaceful drive to work. When you get there, set another intention for the next segment, and so on. Suddenly, what felt like unmanageable becomes an opportunity to be more mindful, less stressful, and far more conscious than if you were to just rush through the day on autopilot in a flurry of negative thinking. This is an opportunity to slow down, infuse each daily segment with what it is that you want, and then begin to reshape the overall feeling place of the day. Remember, at the end of seeking, all is consciousness. Stay in peace.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Supernatural Circumstances, a co-production of Entity Seeker Paranormal Research and Teachings and Good Egg Studios. This podcast is part of the Curious Cast podcast network. Theme music by Corey Johnson of Catalyst Records in Edmonton, Alberta. You can find out more about Morgan Knudsen at entityseeker.ca and more about me and listen to my other show at darkpoutine.com. Feel free to email the show at supernaturalcircumstances@gmail.com. Good night for now.
Hi, it's Shauna, and I might be a bad parent because my kids think French fries are vegetables.
Hey, it's Ryan, and I might be a bad parent because I went out for wings when my wife was in the hospital after giving birth.
Johnny here. I might be a bad parent because in my house, the tooth fairy gives pocket change.
But we're not alone. Len emailed us and said his 6-year-old daughter's Tarzan moment going from love seat to lazy boy by curtains made him more proud than any dance recital.
And Andy left his 2-year-old at the rink.
All right, guys, I'm sure we're not alone. Like Andy's kid.
For stories and confessions like this, make sure you check out our podcast.
It's called Bad Parents, and it's available wherever you get your podcasts.
I left a glove at the rink.